Coming at number 10, we have Edwarda Obara. In 1970, 16-year-old Edwarda was rushed to hospital. She was diabetic and shaking after not getting enough insulin. As she slipped in and out of consciousness, she turned to her mother Kay and said, "Promise me you won't leave me, will you, mummy?" She promised that, but that was the last time they ever spoke. Edwarda fell into a deep coma, a coma which lasted for 42 years. In all that time, her mother never left her side. The mother died in 2007 and Edwarda's sister took over her full-time care. Finally, in 2012, Edwarda herself died at the age of 59, only having been conscious for 16 of those years. Alright, at number 9 now we have the addiction. In 2009, a toddler called Ya Wen was hit by a speeding van in China. She spent 5 days in a coma with severe injuries. When she woke up, she had changed, shall we say. Her mother said that she started acting like an adult. She started drinking 3 glasses of beer a day and smoking cigarettes. A 3-year-old. Her mother found her hiding in a bathroom and smoking after stealing them, but now she gets them on credit from the local store, apparently. I have so many questions. Obviously, I want to know how did this happen at all, but I also want to know what are the parents thinking? Their 3-year-old wakes up from a coma, starts smoking and drinking, and they just go with it? Maybe they're the ones that need to wake up. Alright, next up we have I Love You. You are not going to believe this one. Wendy Richmond is a woman from the UK who slips into a coma every time she tells her grandchildren she loves them. She suffers from conditions such as cataplexy and narcolepsy, which can be triggered by a number of different things, leaving her in a sort of waking sleep state and totally paralyzed. When her grandchildren were born, she realized that one of the things that caused this was having an intense moment of love for them. This strange brain function has meant that she's had to emotionally distance herself from her own grandchildren. She can't run up to them and tell them she loves them without the danger of falling into a coma. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Terry Wallace. In 1984, 19-year-old Terry Wallace was involved in a car accident that left him in a paralyzed state from the neck down and in a coma. Doctors thought he would never regain consciousness ever again, but his parents didn't think that was the case and they put him in a rehabilitation center. They visited him every other weekend for years, and then in 2003, 19 years after the accident, Terry woke up. He saw his mum and said "Mama" and then asked for Pepsi and milk. He slowly recovered, and although he remains disabled and unable to form short-term memories, he can communicate with those around him. However, in many ways he is still trapped in 1984. He refuses to acknowledge that he isn't 19 anymore, and he thinks the US president is Ronald Reagan. One last creepy fact is that this crash happened on Friday the 13th, and Terry started speaking again all those years later on, you guessed it, Friday the 13th. Coming out number 6 now, we have Sam Carter. In 2008, 60-year-old Sam Carter slipped into a coma after a case of severe anemia, where his red blood cell count got too low. At the hospital, he was in a coma for 3 days and was given just a 30% chance of recovery. His wife was desperate and asked if there was anything she could do to help. The doctors suggested playing music to him, so she placed some headphones on his head and played "I Can't Get No Satisfaction" by the Rolling Stones, and he woke up. After fully recovering, Sam said that the song gave him new energy and pulled him out of his coma. The song choice was no accident either. His wife knew that it was the first single Sam had ever bought when he was 17 years old. If you guys were in a coma, what song do you think would wake you up? Next up at number 5 now, we have John Roach. He was a 50-year-old man who chose to be in a coma. He was suffering from chronic pain that left even the slightest touch to his skin feeling like a blowtorch. Nothing had worked, and so he took part in a radical new treatment, a ketamine-induced coma. He slipped into the coma for 5 days while the ketamine restarted his whole nervous system, kind of like rebooting a computer. Then they woke him up and they sent him home with small doses of the treatment to self-administer, but not enough to put him back into another coma. John says his life changed forever. He's now no longer in agony and can enjoy the simple things in life like holding his wife's hand or picking up his grandkids that he just couldn't do before the coma. Alright, coming out number 4 now, we have the sex addict. In May 2010, an 81-year-old granddad was put under house arrest because he developed a sex addiction after falling out of a plum tree and going into a coma for 4 days. That's it. That is the strangest sentence I've ever said in my life, but let's break it down. Angelo De Luca from Switzerland needed an operation after his coma, and when he woke up, he started spending thousands of dollars at a local brothel and fell in love with one of the girls there. That might sound nice, but his son believed he was being preyed upon, and a court gave him control of his father's bank accounts because his sex addiction made him unfit to govern his own affairs. What an unbelievable story. Coming in at number 3 now, we have Half Awake. In 1988, a Polish man called Jan Grebski injured his head while at work on a railroad. He fell into a coma for 15 years, finally waking up in 2003. By that point, Poland had changed a lot, and it was no longer a communist country. People were eager to hear about what he thought of all of that, but Jan said he already knew. He said that he actually woke up from his coma after just 4 years, but he was still paralyzed and mute. He spent a further 11 years in this state before finally being able to talk. He even learned to walk again. I don't know about you guys, but I think that sounds even scarier. I would never want to be conscious but unable to communicate. Sounds like an absolute nightmare. Alright, next up at number 2 now, we have bilingual. People spend years of their lives mastering a second language, but for Sandra Ralic, it came to her in her sleep. This 13-year-old Croatian girl went into a coma for 24 hours, and when she woke up, she was unable to speak Croatian. Instead, she could communicate perfectly in German. This baffled everyone. Her parents said that she had only just started studying German at school, yet here she was, speaking it fluently and now unable to talk in the language she was raised with. If any of you guys are worrying about passing your French exams this year, please don't put yourself into a coma. It's not gonna work. And finally now, at number 1, we have the F-bomb. In 2004, Joey Hopkins, a 22-year-old British man, fell into a coma after a serious car crash. His mother, Joanne, stayed by his bedside every single day for 41 days, hoping that he would show some sign of life. And then, she noticed that he was trying to speak. She leaned in close to him to hear him whisper his first words since falling into the coma, and he said, "F off." Yeah, you heard me right. He told his mum to F off, but she cried with relief. She had told the nurse that she'd know he was getting better if he swore at her, and said that when he actually did, she believed it was his way of telling her he was going to be okay. After that, he slowly began the road to recovery. It's a very weird coma story, I know, but clearly that is a mother who knows the relationship with her son inside and out.
Starting us off like we always do, and at number 10 is Gary Dockery. He was a police officer responding to a call when he was shot in the head by a drunken man in 1988. Since that incident, he was in a coma-like state for 7 years in a nursing home recovering from his injuries. But after he underwent a lung surgery in 1996, he suddenly woke up and began to talk non-stop. He was able to remember his family, his friends, even his horses. Sadly, he died the following year. Miracle Mom comes into this list. Number 9, a woman went into a 7-year coma after she gave birth to a baby girl in 2009. She contracted blood poisoning due to inflammation, which caused her to become comatose. She remained in that vegetable state for 7 years until she shocked the doctors when she suddenly woke up. She pretty much came back from the dead. Take a look at these pictures of this mother meeting her daughter for the first time ever. The recovery process will be long, but at least she's able to watch her daughter now grow up. Next up, number 8 is this father who woke up from a 7-year coma. This is truly an ironic case. A man from South Africa has been in a coma for 7 years, and when doctors gave him a sleeping pill, he woke up. Back in 2005, he was involved in a serious car crash that left him with extensive brain injuries. His wife refused to give up on him, and she was constantly researching information about comas. That's when she suggested to the doctor that they try a sleeping pill called Stilnox. And 5 days after they administered the drug, he woke up, and he was even able to recognize his family and even speak. Ghost Boy comes into this list at number 7. Martin Pistorius fell into a coma when he remained in a vegetable state for 12 years. Doctors predicted that he would die, and his mental capacity was equivalent to a toddler. However, Martin said that he woke up from his coma about 2 years later and was paralyzed, unable to open his eyes or speak. Martin was fully aware of what people were doing and saying, but he couldn't do anything about it. He described it as being trapped in his body as a ghost boy. Finally, 12 years after he initially fell into the coma, he was able to communicate with the help of a computer, and he he is mobile with an electric wheelchair. Next up, number 6, we have Jason Darlin. After spending 16 years in a coma, Jason was able to miraculously wake up from his coma, and now his life goal is to get people to understand how important it is to take life seriously and to treat their bodies well. He is a traumatic brain injury survivor who is trying to spread the message that you should live every day as if it was your last. And you know what? I like that message. Okay, so the man who woke up 19 years later comes in at number 5, Terry Wallace. He was only 19 years old when his truck swerved off a road and plunged down 25 feet into a creek. He was found 24 hours later with a broken neck, paralyzed, and he was in a coma. His family would visit him in a rehabilitation center every other weekend, and miraculously, during one visit, he opened his eyes and spoke. He has suffered from extensive brain damage and left him with poor short-term memory, and he remained stuck in 1984. Another 19-year-old coma survivor comes into this list at number 4. Jan Grozbowski fell into a coma after being knocked over by a rail car in 1988, and doctors predicted that he wouldn't survive for much longer. Well, they were wrong. 19 years later, he woke up from his coma to an entirely different world. He was overwhelmed by the modern world, and he found it really hard to adapt. Sadly, he actually died 2 years later due to a heart attack. Next up, number 3 is the 2-decade coma. Sarah Scantlin had been hit by a truck driver in 1984, and because of her severe injuries, she was left in a coma-like state for 20 years. Unable to respond, eat, or do anything for herself, she was essentially trapped in her body. Suddenly in 2005, she started to communicate, and she was dubbed the medical miracle. Ram Hubin makes its way onto this list at number 2. For 23 years, he was imprisoned in his own body. He was able to listen to conversations around him, but he was unable to move or speak. He could only listen. Could you imagine that? I mean, is this real life right now? Doctors said that he would remain in a vegetable state and he would not be able to feel or even hear anything. This went on for 23 years until a neurologist decided to use a type of scan that discovered that his brain was actually functioning almost normally. This neurologist saved his life, and Ron was given communication techniques so he can live a more fulfilling life. Flight number 1, we have a woman who went to sleep and woke up 30 years later. Annie Shapiro fell into a coma at the age of 50 years old in 1963 when she suddenly woke up nearly 30 years later. She was absolutely shocked when she looked in the mirror. She could barely recognize herself or her family. Imagine waking up and not knowing who you are. She found it hard to adjust to the new world, but after 2 years of physical therapy, she was making some very good progress with walking and eating and adjusting to her new world. That is just amazing. Starting off this list, number 10 with Karen Ann Quinlan, who was in a coma for 10 years. When she was just 21 years old, she became unconscious after she took a strong sedative with alcohol. She was on an intensive diet and she ended up being in a coma. She suffered from an irreversible brain damage when she went into respiratory failure, and over the next few months, her condition continued to get worse. Her parents requested that she should be disconnected from her ventilator because they believed that her daughter was suffering, but hospital officials denied their request. After a long legal battle, they were able to remove her from the ventilator when she later died from pneumonia complications. Next up at number 9, we have a tragic case. A 19-year-old woman's life changed when she swerved off the road and crashed into a tree. She injured her brain and fell into a coma that lasted over a decade. She was being fed by a tube, and just like that, 10 years of her life passed by. Things get even worse. Doctors discovered that her belly had been growing bigger, so they ran a bunch of tests and determined that she was pregnant. A staff member had raped her, and while she was in a nursing home, her parents decided to continue with the pregnancy because they believed their daughter would have kept the baby. Now at number 8, we have John Alcock, who was in a coma for 14 years. This policeman was involved in a tragic car accident that caused him to suffer from a severe brain injury that left him in a coma. His girlfriend continued to take care of him and never stopped believing that one day he might wake up. Sadly, he died at the age of 54 years old after being in a coma for 14 years. Number 7 brings us to Terry Schiavo. She suffered from a heart attack that caused a severe lack of oxygen and brain damage, which left her in an irreversible persistent vegetative state. Her husband argued that she would have wanted to be kept artificially alive if there was no chance of recovery, so he petitioned to have her feeding tube removed. Her parents intervened, and this quickly escalated to a very controversial legal battle that has been taken to the Supreme Court. However, after 15 years of being in a coma with no chance of improvement, her feeding tube was removed by orders of a judge and she died peacefully. A car crash victim comes up next at number 6. An unidentified car crash victim was left in a coma for 15 years. But since then, he has showed signs of life after a nerve simulator was implanted into his chest by neurosurgeons. He was able to follow an object with his eyes and turn his head upon request. This is absolutely amazing. There are still so much to learn about the brain, so this study will shed a lot of light on comatose victims. Agnes Keene moves into number 5. This poor woman went into a coma after she delivered her twin daughters in 1983. She stayed in this unresponsive state for 19 years until she died in 2002. Her husband attempted to sue the hospital for malpractice because they failed to treat an existing condition that led to her coma and eventual death. Moving into number 4, we're talking about Sunny Von Bolo, who was in a coma for a staggering 28 years. Back in the 1980s, she was the subject of a highly talked about criminal case. Her husband was accused of trying to kill her with an overdose of insulin, which sent her into a coma. He was later acquitted of all crimes. Sunny remained in a persistent vegetative state until her death from a cardiopulmonary arrest in 2008. Elaine Esposito comes in at number 3. When she was 6 years old, she was taken to the hospital after she suffered from a ruptured appendix. She underwent surgery, but she never woke up after being put under anesthesia. Over the next 3 decades, Elaine survived numerous of other conditions, such as another abnormal surgery, pneumonia, the measles, and a collapsed lung. She died 37 years later, and she was removed from the respirator. Next up, number 2, we're talking about Eduardo Olvera, who was in a coma for 42 years. She was only 16 years old when she fell into a diabetic coma in 1970. Before she went unconscious, her last words to her mother were, "Promise you won't leave me." Her mother kept her promise and never left her daughter's bedside. She was kept alive by artificial machines, where she stayed in a comatose state for 42 years until she died. Coming into number 1, we have Aruna Shanbeg. She was a nurse from India who was sexually assaulted and strangled with a metal chain. She was left in a permanent vegetative state for 42 years until she died of ammonia. She had been kept alive by a feeding tube until she died of natural causes. The man who raped her was sentenced to 7 years in prison, which I don't think is enough time for the type of crime committed.